Hello and welcome to this IPECA hosted webinar on the challenges and opportunities of raw materials sourcing for the energy transition. Thank you very much for joining today. Hope you're all well. I'm Amy Collins, the Climate Change Manager at IPECA, and I look after the work IPECA does on renewable energy. So just as everyone is settling in, I'll run through some housekeeping items. So we're using a platform called On24 to hold this webinar. And if you're not familiar with it, everything you see on your screen can be moved and resized to your preference. So for example, if you want to expand the presentation slides to full screen, you can do that. We will have a Q&A segment later on in this webinar. So to submit questions to our speakers, use the Q&A tool, which you should find on the left-hand side of your screen, and you can submit these at any time during the webinar. And for the best viewing experience, we recommend closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background, just so this doesn't slow down your computer. And then finally, we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be sent to you afterwards. So thank you again for joining us today. This is the first webinar that IPECA is hosting in a three-part series to deepen understanding around the challenges and solutions to the increased demand for raw materials that will be needed for the energy transition. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers throughout the series to share the work and the initiatives that they're involved in this space, and to discuss the challenges they're facing and the opportunities for the future. And we are starting off this series with this introductory webinar to discuss firstly the metals and minerals that will be needed for the transition and what the demand is going to look like. And then we'll also explore the environmental and socio-economic implications that come as part of that, and also look to the possible approaches to overcoming some of those challenges. And then we'll also touch on the role and the learnings that can be taken from the existing energy industry. Following this webinar, we will have two further webinars, which will dive deeper into some of the key challenges. So on the 22nd of February, which is tomorrow, the webinar will look at embedding circularity across renewable supply chains. And on the 28th of February, the webinar will dive deeper into how we can create sustainable supply chains. So we hope you can join us for all three of those webinars. We'll pop the links to register for those in the chat in just a moment, but you can also find the links on your screen, and that will also give you a bit more information about what will be covered in those webinars and who will be speaking. So joining us today, we have Cara Maths. Cara has recently changed roles, so she is the SEAM Offshore Power Manager for Shell Renewables and Energy Solutions. She's also one of the co-chairs of IPECA's Alternative Energy Task Force. So I'll hand over to Cara in just a moment to tell us a bit more about the work she is doing with the task force and at Shell. And also joining us is Jaimin Jethwa, who's the Circular Economy Strategy Lead at BP. So Jaimin's going to talk us through what the transition is going to look like and the environmental and social challenges that are being faced. So welcome, thank you both for joining. And as I mentioned, we have carved out some time later in the webinar for questions. So if you do have any questions for Cara or Jaimin, please do just submit those using the Q&A tool, which you should find on the left-hand side of your screen. So very briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with who IPECA is, and just to give a bit of context for why we are organizing this webinar series. So IPECA is the Global Oil and Gas Association dedicated to advancing the industry's environmental and social performance. We were formed in 1974 following the launch of the UN Environment Programme to be the key interface between the oil and gas industry and the United Nations. And originally our focus was on environmental and climate issues. But in the 50 years since we started, we've expanded to also bring the industry together on social performance and integrating sustainability. So those are the four strategic pillars that our work is centered around. We're a membership organization, so companies from around the world, and they recognize that they have a crucial role to play in supporting the energy transition, and they're committed to improving their environmental and social performance. And the way in which IPECA helps them to do that is by bringing experts from within our membership together to develop guidance documents and tools and to share learnings and good practice. And then we extend and share this knowledge beyond our membership to reach the wider industry. And then we also work in partnership with many stakeholders beyond our industry, for example, with UN bodies and NGOs. In 2021, we set out a new strategy, and as part of that new strategy, IPECA incorporated renewables into its scope, specifically to support the sustainable scale-up of wind and solar. So that leads me to hand over to Cara now. So Cara's going to tell us a bit more about IPECA's work in this area and how the industry is contributing to the energy transition. So over to you, Cara.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Amy, and good morning, good afternoon, possibly good evening to everybody who is joining. It's very nice to be here today, and I'm very happy that I was asked to co-chair the IPECA Alternative Energy Task Force. As Amy said previously, the Alternative Energy Task Force was established in 2021 as IPECA was going through their 2021 to 2024 strategy review. It really was put in place in order to identify opportunities to support the sustainable scale-up of alternative energy, as Amy said, specifically wind and solar, so that we can promote and share knowledge and good practice on environmental and social issues related to alternative energy. So in essence, collaboration. Also to develop good practice to support our members' alternative energy activities, building on that existing good practice that we all know we have within oil and gas. And lastly, hopefully to be recognized by our stakeholders within IPECA as a credible and positive contributor to the energy transition outside of oil and gas. So with that said, what have we been doing in the Alternative Energy Task Force since we were created? What we have done is we, at the moment, have a literature review that has already been published that identifies existing work on environment and social risks across the supply chain throughout the project lifecycle and lifecycle assessment methodologies to assess carbon footprint. What we aim to do is identify the gaps that existed in literature and knowledge and provide a list of recommended actions and issues that AETF could honestly work on as we move forward. This has also helped shape the work that we're going to be doing this year in 2024 as well. We also have updated an existing compendium of good practice document that IPECA has that maps existing guidance and tools to alternative energy technologies. You can see both of those on the screen there. And if you scan those QR codes, you'll be able to read those documents as well. The compendium was first published in 2020, but it has been updated to include new documents that IPECA has published since 2020. And again, we're hoping to update this and get this published within the next few weeks. But all of this is done so that we can hopefully build upon the things that we've done in oil and gas and apply them through the energy transition. Lastly, about the Alternative Energy Task Forces, obviously, if you are an IPECA member company and have some interest in our organization, we would love to have additional members on the task force. So now moving into, as Amy said, I work for Shell. What is Shell doing in some of these spaces? And I'm going to keep it a little high level here, but what Shell has done is we have put in place our Powering Progress, which are our strategies to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. We're doing this obviously so that we can generate value for our shareholders, our customers, and wider society. As we move forward on this journey, we hope that we're going to power lives while also respecting nature and maintaining our core values. Respecting nature, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there, is one of our 4 goals. And it sets out our ambitions around biodiversity, water, circular economy, waste, and air quality. And what does that really mean? What it means is, it's our approach on how we're going to manage the impacts of our operations on the environment. It also hopes to extend our approach to our supply chain, for example, with commitments around plastics and circular economy. Because at the end of the day, Shell's ambition is to have a positive impact on biodiversity, to focus on using water more efficiently across our activities, to use resources and materials efficiently, and to increase reuse and recycling, to improve our air quality by reducing emissions from our operations and providing cleaner ways to power transport and industry. So hopefully you can see this is also how Shell's hopefully also adding to the energy transition. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Jamin as he's going to take us into his topic.
Many thanks, Cara. Likewise, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everybody, and thanks for being here. My name's Jamin, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the challenges and opportunities of raw material sourcing for the energy transition. You may have seen on the previous slide, if you can't grow it, you have to mine it, and that's sort of a common adage that's gaining a little bit more traction. Hopefully I'll color that in a bit for you, but sort of sets out the stall. So I think the first thing is just to sort of say that I'm going to frame this conversation based around context, challenges, and opportunities. So sort of give you the idea of what's going on, the big picture, hopefully a bit of detail, and then move on through the challenges and opportunities. The overall context is that the energy transition is, fundamentally a raw materials challenge in as much as it requires a lot of material to deliver. Metals and minerals are in the spotlight. The reason I've called them out is because of their specific importance, but there are other materials that are needed. The context is really that the required pace of change is high, the volumes needed are large, and arguably the costs are rising. Obviously, prices go up and down, but the trends seem to indicate an increase. In terms of challenges, generating enough supply is a challenge. Geopolitics and political decisions have an impact. There are environmental and social concerns, but there are equally opportunities in terms of innovation, efficiency, perhaps recycling, some policy support, collaboration between various stakeholders. And hopefully I'll be able to touch on each of these. So just building on that a little bit, apologies for the quality of the image on the right. And just to say throughout this, I've drawn on a range of sources. I've tried to cite every source that I've used. If anyone notices anything that's missing or anything that's not cited, feel free to inform me. It's not through a lack of trying. The question here is, what do we need? Because that will focus our minds on some of the following questions. And if you think, you can either think of it in terms of the key technologies or the key minerals. In terms of the technologies, I think it's fairly easy to figure that we've got low carbon power, things like wind and solar, electricity networks that need to be built out to transmit the power, EVs and batteries for mobility and transport, and things like hydrogen, new fuels like hydrogen that use catalysts and so on. And in terms of minerals themselves that feed into these technologies, the list is long, and the right-hand image gives a sense of that, but maybe some to call out. I started with sand slightly provocatively, knowing that sand is actually just a designation of size of material as opposed to a certain material itself. But silicon chips are important, and although I won't talk much about them, I think I wanted to highlight that. Copper, steel, rare earth elements, and so on all have their part to play, and what part they have to play depends on the technology in question. Things like EVs, wind power, and solar and solar photovoltaic seem to have, there's a strong bias on the right-hand side of this slide to significant materials consumption. So in terms of the pace of change, I like this slide because it really gives a sense of understanding of where we need to go and where we are today. This is from the BP Energy Outlook. I will say now that I haven't drawn on this because it's BP, it's just a useful slide. But if you look at where we are today in terms of installed wind and solar capacity, just before 2020, 2019, we had, a low number, arguably a couple of thousand gigawatts or 1,000 gigawatts installed. And we need to go significantly upwards to the right-hand side of this slide to 2050. For those of you who are not familiar with the BP Energy Outlook, there are 3 scenarios. These are essentially, potential outcomes. They're not predictions, they are not forecasts, they are potential sort of scenarios. New momentum is sort of the trend of today, with a bit of decarbonization and sort of an acceleration. Accelerated and net zero are slightly more aggressive scenarios to reach net zero. But essentially, I think the highlight that I want to draw from this slide is that if you look on the right-hand side, you have the maximum historical build rate, the circles. And across all geographies, the maximum historical build rate is very low compared to where we need to go in the bar charts, which indicate the range from low to high. So we need to increase across the 3 scenarios. If we're to meet the net zero scenario, which is the most aggressive, then we need to significantly increase the rate of build out. Other analysis, I've said external, you could use the word other, but other analysis reflect a similar view. I've taken a couple of examples. The Energy Transition Commission has a report which I draw on through this presentation, but again, if you look at the total transmission and distribution power line length, it's sort of 2.5 to 3 times as needed between now and 2050. So just to, again, I'm trying to paint the picture that of all the transmission and distribution power lines that we've built, we need to build the same again 2 to 3 times by 2050. And in terms of the right-hand side, this is from the IEA, the annual deployment of clean energy technologies by scenario. So you have on the left-hand side, solar PV and wind. In the middle, you have electricity, and on the right, you have electric cars. Again, it's a 3 times, and in the case of electric cars, a 25 times increase in demand. So the point is not the numbers and the accuracy of the numbers, it's the trend and the general direction of travel. And so I guess putting these 2 slides together tells us that the transition has an impact on materials intensity. Again, the source here is McKinsey. But this really, I like the fact that this graph gives quite a graphic explanation of the fact that if you build a coal-fired power plant, you need some steel and you need some copper and some other things, and then you generate lots of power for a long time. Whereas if you build a wind or a solar voltaic plant, essentially you need more material for the same amount of energy. And although it has a much lower emissions intensity, it has a higher materials intensity for the same amount of power. So again, just to put that in context, we need to generate more power, but we need more materials to do that. So. And then the question is, well, if we need to do all this, then do we have enough stuff to do it? And the broad answer seems to be yes. This graph, the dark blue is the cumulative primary demand for all sectors. So that's everything we need. That's the sum total of what we think we need out to 2050. The estimated reserves are what we think we know we've found, and the estimated resources are what we think we know is there. Essentially, we think there's the light green box. We kind of know that there's the light blue box, but we need the dark blue box. So we seem to be in good shape. In terms of copper, that's one that looks like it may cause us some challenges, but across the board, we seem to be generally in good shape. And then the question might be, well, how much does all this cost and at what price does it come? I think I'll talk about that a bit more, but the rapid expansion in wind and solar power is largely underpinned by falls in their cost, according to the BP Energy Outlook, and indeed other forecasts have similar long-term views that efficiency gains and manufacturing gains will play out. I guess the challenge comes in the fact that this is from Thunderset Energy. Manufacturing costs have fallen and indeed have come down significantly for solar, but future costs are mainly determined by materials. And I'll explain this out a little bit more, but essentially if material costs rise, they have a disproportionate impact or increasingly disproportionate impact on the economics of any given project. So while manufacturing gets cheaper, materials take up a greater percentage of the overall cost. So if you look on the left-hand side, this gives an indication. The dotted lines are different technologies. The bottom of the graph shows time from 2012 to 2022. And on the left-hand side, you have the manufacturing manufacturing as a percentage of overall cost. So manufacturing has come down as a percentage of overall cost across technologies, but materials as a percentage of total cost have gone up. And again, on the right-hand side, this is kind of borne out or is explained further, but specifically for solar, you know, a solar panel manufacturing cost has in green across the bottom of the bar chart, and you can see a sort of steady rise to the right-hand side, whereas installation cost is broadly the same, manufacturing costs have gone down, and electronics indeed, they've changed, they've gone down and then come back up a little bit, but essentially materials are where the bulk of costs now lie. So some of the challenges that this brings with it, I think the first one to call out is geopolitics, politics, and trade. And obviously, I've only got a total of 25 minutes to talk today, so I can't really do justice to any single issue, but I'll try and paint an overall picture. Just taking the graph in the middle of the slide, it sort of paints a picture of where things are mined and where things are refined. And the takeaway from this slide for me is really that red is quite dominant on this slide, and red happens to be China, and particularly to the right in terms of where materials and minerals are refined. China has an increasingly dominant role. China has the vast majority of much of the processing capacity for many of the materials and minerals that are required in the energy transition. So that has an impact on people's perceptions, people's nations' feelings, and people's strategic approaches to how they manage that challenge. I think on the left we have mining, and again, it's less stark in as much as there is more diversification across geographies. But in reality, there is still significant concentration of certain minerals and metals. You know, platinum is primarily in South Africa, rare earth elements primarily in China, graphite the same, nickel primarily in Indonesia, and cobalt in the DRC. So this raises a challenge because each of these nations, each of these areas has specific individual challenges associated with them, whether those are environmental, social, socioeconomic, or other. And I think the coming to the quote then at the top, you know, again, just taken from the Energy Outlook, but you know, again, I think this applies more broadly. The scenarios that are set out in the Energy Outlook are underpinned by the assumption, and it is an assumption, that supply chains develop and expand to avoid excessive dependence on individual countries or regions for key materials. And the challenges around security of supply of critical minerals that might imply. And it's quite a big assumption, essentially, is what I'm trying to point out, is that if we don't end up developing more collaborative supply chains or end up diversifying resource access, there is potential for things to, if not sort of slow down, then be much, much more challenging. I might talk a bit more about this towards the end. I'm going to carry on from this point on, but obviously there have been various responses by nations, including the US Inflation Reduction Act and other similar policy initiatives to try and address some of this. But a good point to take away is that, you know, China definitely dominates the refining and processing of many minerals, and that presents its own challenges. So in terms of investment and production, just to give you a big sort of broad picture, the world's largest copper mine, Escondida, it produces around 1,400 kilotons per year. I called out copper. Obviously, these graphs exist for all minerals. I haven't got the time to go through each one, but copper is the most widely used mineral in clean energy technology, primarily because a lot of clean energy points towards electrification, and copper has the properties that we know it has for that use. We need somewhere between 8 and 17 additional Escondidas to come online to produce the mineral we need. At the moment, the next 20 top producers put around 600,000 tons into the system, so less than half of Escondida. So again, just trying to paint a picture of the scale required for build-up. However, ore grades generally are declining and investment seems to be lagging. I guess if you're a mining organization, and I'm not in the mining organization, so I stand to be corrected, but the incentives aren't necessarily quite there. You know, if the price is going up, why would you need to worry too much? But you could focus on shareholder returns instead. The graphic just it sort of describes different the different ore grades by production route. There's different ways you can produce copper from either concentrate or heap leaching, yeah, they generally the trend is downward. Heap leaching also has, although they both have environmental concerns, heap leaching, because it's a leaching process, has potential environmental issues associated with the residue. So another challenge to call out is lead times and permitting. I wasn't aware of this until I started looking into it in more detail, but essentially the lead time for bringing mines online is quite significant. And it does vary across mineral, primarily because of the type of mining involved. But essentially, if you look at nickel and copper, you're talking, you know, call it 15 years plus or minus. Those are significant periods of time to be able to supply the energy transition, when essentially a lot of people are now looking at a 2050 deadline, which is only 25 years away. So how do we overcome that is another question. I think, you know, in terms of refineries, EV assembly plants, these things can be put online much quicker, but actually bringing the metals online can take a little bit longer. There are good reasons for that, and some of them hopefully I'll cover just now. If you think about the environmental challenges involved with some of the production of these materials and minerals, and remembering the scale, the ramp up in scale that is required, I've kind of bucketed them into four things. I think, again, you could expand this, you could contract it, but I've tried to give a little bit of a sense here. Of course, everything is related to the social aspect as well, but I'll talk about them independently. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we know what that means. Mining requires an awful lot of energy to essentially break up, transport, and melt rocks, or the production of metals, I should say, requires an awful lot of energy. Rocks are heavy. There's an awful lot of waste when you're talking about low-level percentages of output. Associatedly, biodiversity is impacted because a lot of these minerals are in pristine or untouched environments, and even when they're not, there's often an impact on the surface of the land and associated impacts downstream of that and upstream of that related to logistics, transport, and process. Water depletion and pollution is an issue for certain minerals more than others, but you know, if you look at places in southern Spain, you have and indeed southern England, you have significant impacts from historic mining of acid mine drainage and so on. So those are sort of the longer term potential impacts. And for things like lithium extraction, there's a lot of brine extraction required for lithium brine processing, which at present, I think the consensus is, although there's not a direct draw on a lot of fresh water, the actual impacts on water tables and aquifers, you know, let's say it could be further investigated. Beyond that, again, there's a lot of processing that needs water, so the requirements on water are significant. And I'll touch a little bit more on that in a second. From waste-related contamination and pollution, I'm talking primarily around tailings dams, and you know, essentially, if you're producing, let's say, copper at 3%, then 97% of what you are mining is waste, and you need to manage that waste in some way. So you end up with towns that have essentially large hills next to them because there's an awful lot of waste to manage. So that's another consideration. Just diving into a little bit more detail, sort of what does that mean? I think the average greenhouse gas emissions intensity for production of selected commodities is on the left. My takeaway from this slide is that it's variable, and indeed the processing is often overlooked, but it can be a predominant piece of the production of greenhouse gases in relation to the production of minerals and metals. I think primarily due to heat required, but not just that. But it's a variable picture across different minerals. The intensity of mining pressure on biodiversity, this is a difficult one to measure and track. I work alongside some very esteemed colleagues here who struggle with this. I know, how do you measure impacts on biodiversity at a granular level is an existential question for businesses. But for what it's worth, Kobayashi et al. have come out with an index, MyBid, which is based on the geographic relationship among land cover, protected areas, and mining operations, to try and give a bit of a sense of which things are worse from a biodiversity impact perspective. And interestingly, copper is very high on that list. This slide, it's gone slightly skewy on the lines, but I'll try and help unpick this. This is the share of production volume by water stress selected minerals. So you've got different minerals in each bar chart or in each bar, and blue is how much of that mineral is produced in a low water stress environment, and red is how much of that mineral is produced in an extremely high or arid water stressed environment, essentially. And I think the two key takeaways, apologies for the circles have been in the wrong place, but if you look at copper and lithium, around half of copper and lithium are produced in areas of high or extremely high stress. And for zinc and nickel, around 1/4 are produced in high or extremely high areas of extremely high stress. So again, just pointing out that significant quantities are needed, significant quantities are produced in these challenging environments. From the social challenges, I wanted to call out a number of them, and I'll talk about each one very briefly. But there are some obvious things like impacts to workforces, and you think about health and safety in the oil and gas industry, the same applies in mining, that there is, it's a high-risk environment, and therefore there are injuries, fatalities, etc. And that remains a risk across the sector. And as the sector expands and grows, presumably that concern will grow accordingly, unless it's mitigated and managed. From an impact on local communities, I've outlined already that environmental challenges are connected, but here we're talking about things like waste and pollution. There's impacts on health, there's impacts on livelihoods. The specifics vary by site, by country, by mineral, but I think we can all understand what we're saying here, and I have a bit more detail on the following slide. Labor rights issues, modern slavery, again, going back to the slide that outlined where the minerals are going to be sourced or currently are being sourced. Some of the countries involved have lower standards for modern slavery and labor rights issues than others. And indeed, there is, the sort of elephant in the room, I suppose, is artisanal mining in certain countries, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for things like cobalt. And I think it doesn't take much research online to find significant challenges that are raised by that operation. In terms of land rights and access, including consultation and consent, I suppose the key takeaway here, FPIC, which is free, prior, informed consent, is a principle that's protected by international human rights standards. And this states that all people have the right to self-determination, and linked to the right to self-determination, all people have the right to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And again, I'll touch on this in the following slide, but that's not always enforced as it might be. Governance and stewardship, I'll talk about this a bit more too, but the there is the potential to have good governance and stewardship, and there are existing examples of this, but I think that there are also counter examples that need to be overcome or managed. EITI is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which aims to promote an understanding of the natural resource management and strengthen public and corporate governance and accountability. The ICMM is the International Council on Mining and Metals. Essentially, their tagline is mining with principles, and if anyone wants to look them up, they've got a very charismatic CEO in Ro Dawan, who has done lots of good things so far. Yeah, so just elaborating a little bit on community impacts, access, and free, prior, informed consent, I think I wanted to make 2 points here. We know the challenges, and activism and support persists across the world. The 3 links on the left-hand side are individual organizations that have essentially blossomed because of the need to address this. And I suppose the question I ask myself is, why have they seen the need to blossom? And maybe one answer potentially is that, you know, business or government or regulators are not doing enough to address the issue themselves. So while I accept that there is going to be activism across a range of issues in any sector or industry, I think it's telling that there are some quite, there's been a lot of movement in this space and continues to be so. I think on the right-hand side, this story, when I sort of heard about this, found out about it, investigated a bit more, I think it's worth sharing if you haven't heard the story already. It's a good example of just a real error, a mistake that was made by the mining company in question here. They destroyed a cultural heritage site of Aboriginal people in Australia. I mean, specifically, the Juukan Gorge was the only inland site in Australia with evidence of human occupation for over 46,000 years, including through the last ice age. So in terms of archaeological significance, cultural significance, heritage significance, it was pretty unprecedented. And through a series of catastrophic mistakes, the mine was destroyed and the site was destroyed. And my point here is that although this is not the norm, it may be well managed in many, many situations. It does still happen, and it needs to be, we need to take steps to prevent it. So I think, again, my point is this is the type of challenge we need to get over or get across. So just rounding out on some opportunities then, I'm going to start with technology. I'm not going to major on this, but there's always, technology will always drive efficiency and hopefully drive the right outcomes in terms of improvements of resource extraction. There are various technologies that are being cited as potentially very important. Who can create a slide deck these days without having AI in it? I've managed to sneak that in. There's precision extraction from drilling, innovations in traceability and supply chain transparency, which can go some way to try and offset the risk of some of the labor rights and modern slavery type related challenges. I guess a question that lots of people would be asking is, why can't we recycle our way out of this problem? I have hopefully allayed that by describing the challenge in terms of the growth and demand that's required. But I think another point to make, I'm not majoring on this just now, but following 2 webinars on embedding circularity and sustainable supply chains should hopefully cover this a bit more. But on the left-hand side, I think what we're saying really is that the efficiency in recycling can reduce primary material requirements, but more innovation and policy support is needed. And again, apologies for the quality of the graphic if it's a bit grainy on the screen, but to kind of walk you through it, on the bottom, you've got the different minerals and metals, and essentially industrial materials on the left, battery mineral materials in the middle, and other energy transition materials on the right-hand side. And the idea is that there is potential, depending on the scenario that you look at, for a significant decrease in primary demand through recycling and innovation. On the right-hand side, I think a couple of points to make on this slide. One is that the sort of light shaded, non-colored in part of all these graphs is the non-energy transition demand. And I think that's important to note that actually for many of these metals and minerals, which are, you know, graphite, cobalt, lithium, etc., across the top of the graph, they're listed out there. Many of these minerals and metals are not just needed in the energy transition. They're needed for other things as well, and whether that's medical or other sectors, and so construction and so on. So there's that to consider. So the demand is not just the energy transition. And then the other two takeaways are that for most of the metals, other than graphite anodes, for most of the metals, the efficiency gains and innovation gains will lead to very similar to wins, if you like. They're kind of equally balanced, is maybe what I'm trying to say. If you recycle lots more, you'll get about the same as innovation can bring you and efficiency can bring you. However, with graphite anodes, the potential for recycling is significant, sort of around 40% decrease in demand through recycling of anodes. And I think that's an interesting one, which, you know, if you look at places like the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, the outcomes there are that there are increasing incentives to recycle and produce battery materials in places like that. So I hold some hope, I suppose, is what I'm saying on this one, because that seems to be playing out. I mentioned ICMM, I mentioned EITI, another one is the DPI, the Development Partner Institute. There are many more, I'm not trying to list them out, I'm just trying to give a flavor of the fact that there are increasingly organized organizations and initiatives to try and resolve some of the challenges and raise the bar for mining. I think raising the bar is what the aim of all these organizations is, you know, setting a minimum set of requirements that is acceptable for extraction and extractives is ultimately going to be a good thing for the societies, communities, and indeed nations in which these organizations can have an impact. I've called out the ICMM Nature Position Statement. I probably don't have time to go into much detail on that. It's sort of, I suppose there's, it's something to look at. It's quite a transformative statement, and it is worth following up with. So just rounding out then, I think, you know, done well, mining comes with a range of benefits. The challenge is to do it well. We want reliable, sustainable, and responsible mining. You know, it brings development, it alleviates poverty, it opens economic opportunities, improves livelihoods, brings jobs, you know, can result in increased education. All these things are possible. And if you look at a place like Botswana, you know, a huge amount of its GDP comes from diamond mining. So again, my point, regardless of the sort of words on the slide, my point on this is we can do this. It's possible to do this well. We just need to put the measures in place to do it well. I've listed out some of the sources I've used. I think, you know, hopefully I've been clear that this is not my own work for the bulk of it, so hopefully this is helpful. But just to finish up and say thank you very much for your time, and happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Damien, for your excellent presentation, and Cara as well for your presentation. Super interesting and lots for us to consider. We have time for questions now, so perhaps we can dive a little further into some of these considerations. And we have got quite a lot of questions coming into the Q&A, so we'll try and get through all of them in this time. But please do keep putting your questions into the Q&A. So first, just maybe to get us going with the questions, do you see the pace of change accelerating or dropping when it comes to the energy transition and the raw materials demand? And what implications do you think that will have? Jamin, perhaps I can hand that over to you to comment on first.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I think it's a little bit of a, you know, if you're looking at the pace of change, it's a bit of a pick your poison question to some extent, but it's not my home game. It's an economic forecasting question for economists. But from my perspective, I see the pace of renewables deployment continuing to increase. I think it won't drop, but you're battling with the challenges that I've outlined. So I think the pace of change will continue to increase. There's some constraints, maybe by price inflation, maybe by demand increases, and maybe even constraints from supply that might come into play. But I think generally companies are going to have to be much smarter about their material resourcing. I think they're going to have to be they're going to have to navigate geopolitical issues, make sure they've got redundancy in their critical supply chains. And I know that future webinars are going to hopefully talk a little bit about that. And also be increasingly informed about the provenance of their materials. I don't think consumers are going to continue, as this becomes bigger and bigger, I don't think consumers are going to accept any old mineral. I think they're going to want assurances. But ultimately, the energy demand remains, an integer. We need to get to a certain number of energy units, joules. And to meet that, we're going to need to make some changes. And we've shown that we're not very good at making change. We all want the lifestyle that, developed nations have. In essence, that's what people are aspiring for. So it's a tricky one, I think, to comment more broadly, I think. But yeah, I don't think that the pace of change will drop. I think it might just it might be tempered by certain external factors, but I don't think it will drop.
Thanks, Jamin. Kara, did you want to add anything to that?
No, Jamin is definitely the expert in this. Thank you.
Great. And you touched on some of the social and geopolitical challenges. And we have a question here just asking, what can businesses do to promote peace and tranquility in areas infested by conflicts, exploitation of materials used in the energy transition? Jamin, do you want to take that on again first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe a brief answer is do whatever you can to instill the right governance procedures, ensure that you're advocating for policies that are progressive, ensure that you're joining up to membership organizations like EITI or ICMM or whatever it might be, IPICA, that are trying to raise the bar. I think I spoke about that at the end, raising the bar, making sure that international standards are set at a level that's acceptable is going to drive that kind of behavior. Business is not the police of the world. We can't pretend that everything we do will play out perfectly, but equally we can indicate directionality, and I think that's a couple of ways to do that. I think we've lost Amy, which is a shame, but are you back, Amy?
Great, thank you. I think just building on the... Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Not sure what happened there. Just to build on the geopolitical aspect side of things, how have the various geopolitical responses to the challenges you've described varied?
Yeah, so I think there are different strategies in play, and it's obviously a big question to answer, but I'll do my best to give it a quick shot, is that if you look at the IRA in the US, it's doing tremendously well at attracting business to the country. In 2023, for example, German companies doubled the amount of investment that they made in the USA from around $8.5 billion to more than $15 billion. So that's one response, is make it attractive to do business here. Another one, in China, they played a long game. They've now, arguably sewn up the processing for mineral resourcing or primary processing. That was their approach and their strategy, and that's having its own geopolitical implications. And so when you look at the EU, I think really it's navigating quite a challenging time at the moment. It's got elections this year. There's some uncertainty as to the direction of travel that will lead to. But inherently in there, they need to respond to both China and the US. And although, the EU is facing this issue of trying to remain competitive, while at the same time trying to some extent price in some of the externalities that I've described in some of the slides, where they want to show leadership, they want to show stewardship, they want to be progressive on a lot of these issues. but not everyone is playing on that same level playing field. And so, how does the EU go further with that without making itself uncompetitive? And I think it's really grappling with that issue at the moment. So there are different responses that have come through. And I mean, Russia, for example, I heard yesterday or the day before that they seem to be doubling down on making inroads into African nations to support their minerals extraction. So they're playing a very direct one-to-one game with African nations. So I think the responses have been varied and incongruous as far as I can tell. And some seem to be being more successful than others. I don't get the sense that it's a very kind of collaborative and collegiate situation at this point.
Thank you. So just changing slightly, question related to circularity. How significant do you think materials or material replacement and increased recyclability is to the reduction in the overall mineral demand?
Yeah,
Jamin, do you want to go?
Sorry, you broke up for a second. Do you mind repeating the question? Apologies.
Yeah, so it's a question around circularity. How significant do you think new materials or material replacement and increased recyclability is to the reduction in the overall mineral demand?
Yeah, good question. I don't think I have a very strong answer to this, to be brutally honest. At the moment, with what we've got, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. There's some possibilities of substitution, for example, in batteries with sodium-based battery technologies, copper for long-distance transmission lines, and so on. But I think a lot of those things are priced into the projections and the forecasts and the demand curves. I don't think that there's anything transformational, and certainly I could be very wrong. I'm not a technologist, and there could be stuff coming down the road that is going to completely change the game. But essentially, yeah, I don't think there's sort of a magic bullet on this one whatsoever. And indeed, I think that where the innovation needs to come is in how do we design the minerals, the technologies to be recycled, and then recycle them so that we keep the metals and minerals in the system. A good example is with solar. It uses a significant amount of the world's silver, but a lot of that is lost because we recycle 95% of a solar panel by weight, but that's primarily silica and steel and aluminium. We lose a lot of the precious minerals and metals, and we need to get better at doing that and not doing that.
Thank you. And the webinar that we're holding tomorrow is going to focus on this topic and circularity. So hopefully we can dive into that a bit further. And just related to this, so Kara, you spoke about how nature is part of Shell's strategy to help manage the impacts of your operations on the environment, and then also extending that approach with your supply chain. Could you tell us a bit more about the actions that Shell is taking to respect nature?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we recognize that there's a growing urgency to protect biodiversity and preserve water quality, availability, et cetera. And with that, nature loss and climate change are interconnected, and they need to be tackled together. And so, we put this together in order to, our Shell's Respecting Nature commitments, in order to, that is our answer on how we're going to address that, or how we're going to, move forward with that going as we go forward. I mean, as a business, Shell relies on so much for, of the natural resources for what we do, and we understand that we can have an impact on that. So we're hoping that our proactive approach will help us improve operational efficiencies, mitigate risks, and impacts to nature, and to build better relationships with communities and our stakeholders. We also hope that it not only helps our customer-facing businesses, but also helps us create new business models and collaborations. Yeah. In addition, excellent. Shell has set targets to become, a net zero business by 2050, right? As I said earlier. Because for us, we believe that achieving the goals of the UN Paris Agreement is really vital and important. We've also set ambitions and commitments, as I said earlier, across biodiversity, water, circular economy, waste, and air quality. Yeah. And lastly, some of you may be aware that Shell is also invested in nature-based solutions projects, right, which are there in our mind to protect, transform, and restore land. So those are some of the ways that Shell hopes to address this. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cara. Just moving to the opportunity side and technology, there are a couple of questions here. How much of the reduction in cost for solar panels is due to advances in technology versus perhaps cheap labor or subsidized energy to make the panels?
So I don't know.
Jamin,
I don't have any analysis to give me a sense. Sorry, do you want to answer that, Cara?
No, I'm fine. Go ahead.
Sorry, I had to voice apologies. So yeah, I don't have any analysis to give me a kind of numerate answer on this. If I was to insinuate or to guess, I think actually for the case of solar, the vast majority will be from technological advances. I'm not suggesting that the solar supply chain and labor supply chain is by any means perfect. I'm sure there are significant issues, gaps, improvements to be made. But I think in terms of the actual cost of the panels, there have been some massive increases in efficiency. I mentioned silver earlier. The amount of silver used continues to fall, and silver is a very expensive commodity. The production of silica grade or the production of panels, which relies on production of silica, has become incredibly more efficient alongside semiconductor chip manufacturing, for example, because of the scale of manufacture of semiconductor chips. China spent more on semiconductor chips than oil last year, for example. So there are significant scale advantages to some of these technologies that will drive the cost down.
Thank you. We're running out of time here, but there are a couple of questions around deep sea mining. I wondered if I could just get your thoughts on that. They might be questions that are a little bit difficult to answer. So we have one: is deep sea mining a necessity to reach net zero by 2050?
It's a great question.
Obviously, it's quite hard to give a definitive answer to that, but to give your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're an advocate of deep sea mining, then it is a necessity, and if you're not an advocate of deep sea mining and you hold significant environmental concerns, then it's not a necessity, and we'll have to find another way. And I think that's the range of answers that you're going to get across this. If you look at the TMC, the metals company, they will tell you that their research shows there's very limited exposure to the deep sea and the biodiversity impact. If you talk to many more other NGOs and even governments, including the UK's government, who put a moratorium on it, there's significant risks or concerns about the unknowns. And I think that's it. It's just a very uncertain sort of situation. So is it necessary? I think it depends who you ask. But humans have ingenuity that have driven lots of technological breakthroughs over historical time scales, and maybe that's the way to go. But yeah, it's an existing and existential question. I'm not going to be drawn either way, but it's one potential solution.
Thank you. We're just about out of time, unfortunately. I know there are so many questions that we've received here and we've not got to them, but we can perhaps try and follow up after this webinar to try and get answers for these questions. I had a couple of final remarks and thoughts from you both, Cara and Jamin, and perhaps just, how do you see this rolling out and playing out in the future. What was your final thoughts?
Yeah, Cara, do you want to go ahead?
No, feel free to go first, Jamin.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think in the future, I think people are becoming increasingly aware of the real life challenges that exist to switch to an energy infrastructure as embedded, as ubiquitous as the one we have today. It's not as simple as just stopping one and starting another. So I think the vast majority of people recognize the basis for an energy transition, and that's not really the question that's being widely debated, but it's the pace and the method, and we need to think about being more. Personally, I think we need more pragmatism, more conversation with communities, with other stakeholders. And I think the polarization that exists doesn't help us. I think nobody wins, it slows things down, and it's sort of suboptimal. So I think we all need to work together more closely to try and solve what is a challenge for the entire sort of globe.
Absolutely,
Brilliant.
Jamin. My comments were literally going to be the energy transition is much easier said than done. It's going to cost an enormous amount of money to get us out of the system that we've been entrenched in for decades and decades. And it's going to also require an enormous amount of collaboration and less decisive bickering and more collaboration across the globe. And hopefully, I think, organizations like IPECA can help us move in that direction.
Fantastic. Excellent presentations, and thank you for taking the time to answer all these questions. And thank you everyone for joining today. And for the number of questions that you've put into the chat here. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but we'll have a look at the questions afterwards and perhaps we can get back to you. As mentioned, this is being recorded, so the recording will be sent to you in the next couple of days. If you have any further questions about this webinar or IPECA, please reach out to us through email or through the social media links that you can see here. We hope you can join us for the next 2 webinars, which are going to be focused on circularity and supply chain over the next week. And thank you very much once again. And thank you, Jamin and Cara, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.